Usually when we think about a war zone, there is this expectation of a clear, almost geographic boundary.
Right, like a physical separation.
Exactly. You have the front lines with the sandbags, the checkpoints, the barricades, and then miles away, you have the safe zone.
Yeah, it feels very binary. Like you either in the war or you are out of it.
But then you step into San Salvador in 1985, and suddenly that map in your head is just completely useless.
Completely useless.
We are looking at a landscape that is dangerously contradictory. On one side of the city, you have bombed-out buildings, rolling blackouts, and heavily armed soldiers in combat gear just lounging at intersections.
The inescapable, stark reality of a brutal civil war just playing out in the streets.
But then, literally just blocks away, you walk into a wealthy district called the Zona Rosa, the pink zone.
It's quite the contrast.
It really is. I mean, put yourself in that setting. You've just walked out of a militarized, war-torn grid and into a bubble where you are suddenly holding an imported whiskey under soft patio lights.
Right. Waiters are carrying plates of grilled meat to iron tables on the sidewalk. American movies are playing at the theater right down the street.
It is a space where diplomats, expats, and the local elite are actively, aggressively pretending the war does not exist.
And that extreme contrast, that artificial bubble of peace in the middle of a conflict zone, is exactly what makes the source material for this deep dive so vital.
Because it shatters that bubble.
Exactly. When you think of history, you often picture grand, sweeping battles or politicians signing treaties in opulent rooms. But sometimes, the true turning points of a massive geopolitical conflict happen at a casual sidewalk cafe like Chili's.
Wow. Yeah.
We are going to explore how a single night at a restaurant became an absolute flashpoint in the final decade of the Cold War.
So today's deep dive into the book Blood in the Pink Zone is on a mission to understand the June 19, 1985 massacre that completely shattered that illusion of safety.
It really did.
We are going to look at the night that left 4 off-duty U.S. Marines and 9 civilians dead. And we are going to trace the incredibly complicated, decades-long search for justice that followed.
It's a heavy topic, but an important one.
Definitely. Okay, let's unpack this, starting with how perfectly, almost deceptively normal that Wednesday evening felt.
You really have to understand the texture of that normalcy to grasp the shock of what happened. I mean, the Zona Rosa hadn't always been there. It had expanded quickly as a kind of response to the stress of the era.
Right.
Boulevard del Hipódromo was this concentrated strip of nightlife and leisure. You had restaurants like Chili's, Mediterranean, Flashback, all sitting right next to each other, shoulder to shoulder.
Just a bustling district.
Yeah, their tables literally spilled out onto the pavement. You have the clinking of glasses, soft music playing from the open doors.
Think of the Zona Rosa as a psychological fortress,
Ooh, I like that term.
Yeah, the security wasn't just physical. It was the architecture of denial. It was a place where these people could essentially buy a few hours of normal life.
And if you look at the source text, nobody needed that normal life more than the Marine Security Guard detachment stationed at the American Embassy.
Right, because that is a highly selective, intensely isolating job.
It really is. We are so used to thinking of Marines in terms of combat patrols or massive amphibious landings, but these specific men were guarding highly classified diplomatic material.
Just standing there for hours.
Long, grueling hours. Standing repetitive posts inside reinforced windowless buildings.
That was to take a toll.
The mental toll of that constant vigilance, knowing that a single moment of complacency could result in a catastrophic intelligence breach or a deadly attack on the embassy, is massive. It wears you down to the bone.
And that psychological wear and tear is exactly why they needed to get out of the embassy compound.
Absolutely.
The inciting incident for them ending up in the Zona Rosa that night is actually a very relatable, very human moment.
The dinner, right.
Yeah. So 6 off-duty Marines are hanging out at the Marine House. They finish their shifts. The mood is easy, they're unwinding, and then the dinner tray is uncovered in the kitchen.
And it's liver and onions.
Liver and onions.
A culinary breaking point for 20-something guys anywhere, let alone in a high-stress environment like that.
I mean, honestly, who can blame them? Lance Corporal Bobby Joe Dixon looks at it, and the source text notes, he joked, quote, "No chance. This is a third world country. We don't know whose liver that is."
Just that dark, classic barracks humor.
Exactly. So they completely reject the embassy dinner, and someone naturally suggests the Zona Rosa. They pile into a vehicle and head over to Chili's for beers and nachos instead.
And when they arrive, the atmosphere on the patio is completely relaxed. Corporal Anton Kozuth actually spots some colleagues from the embassy sitting at a nearby table.
Right, Rob Tyndall from Communications and Sandra Castro from the Visa section.
Yep. So the Marines pull their table up near them. It creates this casual mixing of different worlds.
Just people hanging out.
You have expats, American computer engineers from Wang Laboratories just finishing their workdays, Salvadoran professionals celebrating a birthday, and these off-duty Marines in civilian clothes, all just blending together on the pavement.
But that physical exposure on the patio wasn't just a security flaw. To the opposing forces in this civil war, it was a tactical invitation.
Right.
Let's look at why this specific oasis was targeted. Because the war wasn't actually somewhere else. It was just waiting for the right moment.
To understand the mechanics of that moment, we have to look at the decades of severe imbalance in El Salvador.
Okay, let's get into the history a bit.
Yeah, for most of the 20th century, the country's economy and politics were effectively controlled by a tiny, ultra-wealthy elite.
Historically referred to as the 14 families.
Exactly. They held the vast majority of the wealth, the land, the lucrative coffee and cotton estates, all while relying on a deeply impoverished, largely rural labor force.
And they wanted to keep it that way.
Right. The political system actively suppressed any dissent to maintain that heavy concentration of power.
Though there was an attempt to reform that system from the inside, right? A reformist military coup in 1979 that promised to redistribute land and open up the political process.
Yes, there was. But it failed to hold any real ground. Right-wing factions and their civilian allies within the establishment quickly sidelined the reformers.
And that's when things really deteriorated.
Following that collapse, the violence rapidly accelerated. By 1980, the opposition realized that fractured resistance simply wasn't working. So they umbrellaed under one massive coalition, the FMLN, the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front, to systematically dismantle the state infrastructure through guerrilla warfare.
Now, the reality of this conflict, as detailed in our sources, and we really want to just report what the texts say here without taking a side, is that it was a landscape of absolute brutality on multiple fronts.
Completely.
The Salvadoran military and aligned right-wing death squads, which received extensive funding and training from the United States, carried out systemic torture, targeted assassinations of political opponents, and horrific massacres.
It was devastating.
The text specifically cites the infamous 1981 El Mozote massacre, where a U.S.-trained military battalion slaughtered hundreds of unarmed civilians, including children, in a rural village.
And on the other side of the conflict, the sources document how the FMLN heavily utilized devastating tactics to destabilize the country.
Right.
They planted landmines along rural roads that frequently killed non-combatants, they assassinated local mayors and officials, and relentlessly attacked the economic infrastructure, like bombing bridges and power grids.
Oh, total chaos.
They believed that weakening the state's capacity to function, even if it resulted in massive civilian suffering, was the only way to force a shift in the balance of power.
And the U.S. perspective on this, especially in the wake of the Sandinista revolution in neighboring Nicaragua, the Reagan administration's math on this was simple. El Salvador couldn't fall.
It became the ultimate Cold War proxy laboratory.
Yeah. The U.S. began pouring more than $1 million a day in economic and military aid into the Salvadoran government. American military advisors were deployed to train local units operating out of a massive, heavily fortified embassy in the capital.
The U.S. presence was substantial, deeply embedded, and highly controversial. El Salvador had essentially been designated as the global test case for containing leftist movements in the Western Hemisphere.
But wait, I have a question here. If the FMLN is primarily fighting a rural insurgency, ambushing military patrols in the mountains and bombing bridges, why send a hit squad into a wealthy urban district to target a group of unarmed off-duty Marines eating nachos?
It seems counterintuitive, right?
Yeah, that seems like a massive, incredibly risky escalation that would just invite overwhelming retaliation.
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, it is actually a highly calculated strategic shift. A specific militant faction of the FMLN, known as the PRTC, operated an urban unit called the Martiqueo Cruz Urban Commando. They looked at the war and believed that rural firefights in the mountains simply weren't shocking the public or the international community anymore.
It just became normalized.
Exactly. It had become background noise. They wanted to fundamentally shatter the illusion of safety in the capital.
So by deliberately targeting them in a civilian space, the FMLN is essentially turning the concept of being quote-unquote off-duty into a myth.
Exactly. To the Marticchio cruise unit, those off-duty Marines were not just young men having a beer. They were the most visible, accessible symbols of U.S. financial and military intervention.
Never targets.
Striking them directly in the heart of the Zona Rosa, the very place the elite went to feel safe, would send a wave of terror directly into the establishment.
So they planned this out carefully.
Very carefully. They had watched the district for weeks. They mapped the traffic flow, the restaurant seating patterns, how long the Marines typically stayed, and where they liked to sit. They knew that the outdoor terrace at Chili's left them completely exposed to the street.
Which puts us right back on the pavement outside Chili's on that Wednesday night. The surveillance suddenly transforms into kinetic, overwhelming violence.
It happens so fast.
A white Toyota Hilux pickup truck rolls slowly to the curb.
And initially, there is absolutely no panic on the patio. In San Salvador in 1985, an armed truck pulling up to a restaurant usually just meant soldiers doing a routine, albeit annoying, ID check.
It's a normal inconvenience.
Yeah, it was part of the background scenery.
But then the doors open. Men jump out wearing jeans and camouflage shirts, and they're carrying M16 assault rifles.
No ID check.
They don't ask for identification at all. They immediately point the rifles directly at the Marines' table and open fire. The source material describes the noise hitting the patrons like a physical wall.
I can only imagine.
This isn't a random, chaotic drive-by shooting. It's a concentrated, highly coordinated ambush. When that Toyota Hilux pulled up, the M16 fire didn't just break the glass at Chili's. It completely demolished that architecture of denial you mentioned earlier.
The sheer brutality of those first few seconds is staggering. The initial volley of rounds completely smashes the Marines' table. Glass is exploding everywhere. People are screaming and instinctively diving under iron chairs.
Cold panic.
The gunmen move methodically, closing the distance. What is truly horrifying is the coldly calculated nature of the violence.
Right, because they didn't just shoot from the street.
No. After the initial burst, when Marines like Greg Weber and Tom Hanwork had collapsed to the ground, wounded but alive, the lead attacker actually stepped forward. He moved closer to fire downward into them from near point-blank range.
Wow. It's an execution, right in the middle of a dining district. Meanwhile, total chaos erupts across the street and on the adjacent patio.
People are just trying to survive.
Yeah, Corporal Anton Kossuth's infantry training kicks in before his conscious brain can even process the event. He sees Sandra Castro from the embassy frozen in absolute terror under a nearby table.
Just frozen.
Anton violently grabs her arm and screams at her to crawl toward the doorway of the Mediterranean restaurant next door.
He is physically watching the trajectory of the tracer fire, waiting for fractions of a second between bursts to move people out of the kill zone.
That's incredible under that kind of pressure.
And once he gets Castro and himself inside Mediterranean, they realize the immediate danger isn't over. The restaurant has these massive open bay windows facing directly onto the street.
Oh, no.
One gunman could easily walk up to the window and slaughter everyone huddled inside by the bar.
So Anton looks at the bartender and demands to know where his gun is.
Yeah.
And the bartender is completely stunned, practically catatonic, and stammers that he doesn't have one.
Which blows Anton's mind.
Yeah, because, as he thought, every single person in El Salvador seemed to own a firearm. Realizing they are defenseless, Anton asks where the main light switch is.
Quick thinking.
He drops low, crawls on his stomach through the shattered glass, while 5.56 rounds are physically snapping through the air overhead. He jumps up, hits the main dimmer switch on a pole, and plunges the entire restaurant into darkness to hide the terrified civilians.
It is a remarkable display of situational awareness and leadership under extreme chaotic fire. And outside, the crossfire is escalating rapidly. It is completely out of control.
It wasn't just the attackers shooting at that point.
No, a civilian sitting near Chili's actually pulls a personal handgun to try and fire back at the attackers, but he is instantly torn apart by the gunman's return fire.
Jeez.
Then the private guards stationed at the Brazilian ambassador's residence across the street hear the commotion and start shooting blindly into the fray. One of the guerrilla attackers is actually shot in the back during this exchange and has to be dragged away to the truck by his companions.
Just a war zone on a patio.
Yeah.
And when the shooting finally agonizingly starts to fade, the surviving gunmen load up their truck, hit the gas, and disappear back into the labyrinth of the city.
And that's when Anton reacts.
Yeah, Anton gets on his concealed embassy radio. The local emergency channels are just a solid wall of screaming and static, so he commands everyone with military authority to clear the net. And he makes the call that every embassy dreads. Quote, "This is MSG detachment. We've got 4 Marines down."
That radio call fundamentally shifted the rules of engagement for the entire region. This wasn't two armies clashing in a remote jungle, and it wasn't a tragic instance of civilians caught in a crossfire between military
Well,
units.
this was different.
This was a deliberate, planned execution in a civilian recreational space. It blurred the lines of combat to a point where the very concept of a non-combatant felt almost meaningless.
You have the pure adrenaline and horror of the attack, but the aftermath the next morning is just haunting in its emptiness.
So eerie.
The sun comes up, and restaurant workers are out on the pavement, silently using garden hoses to wash the blood off the sidewalks before the heat sets in. The acrid smell of gunpowder is still hanging heavy in the humid air, making a cafe district smell like a battlefield.
13 people dead. 4 American Marines and 9 civilians who simply went out for dinner.
And back at the American Embassy compound, the mood is absolutely crushed.
I can't even imagine.
Marines are staying awake for 2 straight days drinking coffee. Because every time they close their eyes, they see the smoke, the shattered glass, and the bodies lying under the patio lights.
The Marine House, which is usually this loud, energetic hub of guys talking trash, lifting weights, and playing music, is just totally silent.
Every empty chair in the common room is a devastating reminder. Our sources share these highly specific memories that really bring home the humanity of who was lost that night.
Yes, because to the public, they quickly became names on a casualty list. But to that detachment, they were the individuals who held their tightly knit community together.
Take Greg Weber, for example. He was this incredibly strong, unpretentious guy from the Midwest. The text recounts a story where the detachment is doing physical training in the brutal, suffocating Salvadoran heat.
Which is no joke.
Right. Weber jumps up and does 20 dead hang pull-ups, which is exhausting. And Anton yells out, joking, telling him to grab the massive top support poles of the apparatus and do another one.
Like a hazing kind of thing.
Yeah, but Weber doesn't get mad at the hazing. He just grins, grabs the top poles, and forces his chin over the bar. He says, "This one's for you, Kaisuth."
Wow.
Then he screams and does another one. "This one's for my mom," and another one. And this was for the Marine Corps. He was the kind of guy who was naturally a powerhouse, but completely without ego.
And then you have Staff Sergeant Thomas Handwork. He was the anchor of the group. He possessed this deep, calm professionalism.
The older brother figure.
Exactly. The younger Marines joked about his ADAC stare, this distant, 1,000-yard look he developed from serving a tough, incredibly isolated tour in ADAC, Alaska.
Ah, I see.
But when it came to the job, his gear was immaculate. His boots were perfectly polished. He was the standard that everyone else measured their own discipline against.
And in the span of 45 seconds, they were just gone.
Just gone.
So, 3 days later, June 22, 1985, the massive political fallout begins. President Ronald Reagan travels to Andrews Air Force Base to receive the flag-draped coffins arriving from Central America.
This is a huge moment.
It is. He is deeply haunted by the Beirut barracks bombing from 2 years earlier, where 241 service members were killed. He stands on the tarmac, looks directly at the grieving families, and makes a very clear, very public, very absolute promise.
A vow to find them.
Yes. He vows that the men responsible for the Zona Rosa attack will be tracked down. He says the United States will move any obstacle necessary to bring these terrorists to justice.
It was the kind of resolute, absolute statement that suggests the world can be ordered and justice can be delivered if a superpower simply has the will to enforce it.
Right.
But the reality of El Salvador in the 1980s did not yield to that kind of moral certainty.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because you have this incredibly firm promise made in front of the world's cameras, and then you have the messy, completely compromised reality of backroom diplomacy, intelligence gathering, and amnesty that actually happens next.
The timeline of justice isn't a straight line.
No, it is incredibly murky and full of compromises.
Extremely murky. Late in 1985, Salvadoran authorities do manage to make a couple of arrests of lower-level individuals involved in the attack.
Okay, so some progress.
Well, these men confess under interrogation and name their higher-level commanders. But then the legal proceedings just inexplicably stall in the Salvadoran military courts for years.
You look at the mechanics of that stall,
Right.
and it's all about wartime politics. There are deep questions about the independence of the Salvadoran judiciary, which is heavily influenced by the military.
Nobody wants to upset the delicate balance of power.
Right. But then, in 1989, there's a massive break in the case.
Yes. Salvadoran authorities arrest a man named Pedro Antonio Andrade on completely unrelated charges. He was operating under the alias Mario.
Mario, okay.
During his detention, he is definitively identified as a senior PRTC commander. More importantly, he is identified as the alleged logistical mastermind who actually planned, mapped, and ordered the Zona Rosa attack.
So you look at that and think this is it. This is the moment Reagan's promise on the tarmac is finally kept. The mastermind is in handcuffs.
You would think so.
But instead, we see this intense, high-stakes tension between the desire for criminal prosecution and the insatiable need for wartime intelligence.
This is the brutal moral math of modern conflict. Andrade wasn't just a terrorist to the U.S. government. He was an absolute goldmine of intelligence.
He knew everything.
He knew the FMLN supply routes, their safe houses, their command structures. For 2 years, U.S. intelligence agencies, the State Department, and Salvadoran officials are engaged in incredibly complex, often bitter backroom negotiations regarding his status.
So the CIA, or military intelligence, is essentially saying, we can use this guy's information to dismantle guerrilla networks and potentially save hundreds of lives. Meanwhile, the Department of Justice is screaming, this man ordered the murder of 4 American Marines. You cannot protect him. He needs to be in a courtroom.
Precisely. The need for actionable wartime intelligence actively competes with and often supersedes the pursuit of a trial. And before that interagency warfare can fully resolve, the entire geopolitical landscape shifts right under their feet. In January 1992, the Chapultepec peace accords are signed, formally ending the 12-year civil war.
The war ends.
The FMLN agrees to lay down their weapons and transitions into a legitimate political party.
Which changes everything about how the combatants are viewed legally. And then, the very following year, in 1993, El Salvador passes a general amnesty law.
A sweeping piece of legislation designed to allow the country to move forward without endless tribunals. But practically, it shields almost all individuals involved in wartime actions on both sides from prosecution.
Including the Zona Rosa attackers.
Including those directly connected to high-profile atrocities like the Zona Rosa massacre.
It placed a massive, insurmountable legal barricade in front of accountability. It was so contentious that by 1996, the U.S. Department of Justice released an Inspector General report.
An incredibly frustrating read, I'm sure.
Yeah, that report explicitly highlighted the deep frustrations within the DOJ over how the investigation was handled, laying bare the constant unresolved tension between the intelligence community's priorities and the actual pursuit of legal justice for the victims.
If we synthesize everything we've looked at in this source material, the Zona Rosa massacre stands as a profound reminder of the true nature of modern geopolitical conflict.
It really does.
On the grand chessboard of global politics, proxy wars, and intelligence gathering, governments move pieces, make backroom deals, and eventually sign peace treaties. But the true cost of those maneuvers is always paid by individuals.
These normal people.
Marines stationed thousands of miles from home just trying to carve out one single hour of normal life. Civilians enjoying a birthday dinner, completely caught in the crossfire of a war they thought they were insulated from.
It's tragic.
Their lives are abruptly, violently ended. And then as the years pass and the political winds shift toward amnesty, their pursuit of justice is slowly reduced to unresolvable entries in a classified case file.
It leaves you wondering about the evolution of modern warfare itself. When you look at the tactical reasoning of the PRTC that night, bypassing hardened military targets to strike a vulnerable patio, did the perceived, quote-unquote, success of the Zona Rosa attack effectively write the modern playbook for targeting soft civilian spaces?
It's a terrifying thought.
It forces us to ask if the terrifying blueprint we see in so many contemporary global conflicts was actually drafted under the patio lights of a restaurant in 1985.
That is a chilling but entirely necessary question to consider.
When a war officially ends with peace accords and amnesty laws, a nation might be able to move on. But for the families of the 13 people killed that night under the patio lights of the Pink Zone, does peace without true accountability ever actually feel like the war is over?
I don't think it does.
Thank you all for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the narratives and keep looking beneath the surface of history. Because sometimes the most important turning points aren't marked by bronze statues or peace treaties. Sometimes they happen at a sidewalk cafe that was just pretending the war wasn't there.